Hello everyone, I'm Myno van Dyke. This is
Bert Vandenheuvel.
and today we're going to do a presentation on the liberation of the Netherlands. It's kind of a two-part presentation. The first part is about the liberation of the Netherlands and the fine relationship between the Canadians and the Dutch and how that evolved, especially during World War II. And the second part is essentially about our families. We both, not together, but separately, our families immigrated here in the early 1950s, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. Normally we'd be doing this on May the 4th, but today we're doing it a little later because of the COVID-19. Well, in May of 1940, the German soldiers invaded the Netherlands, and it was a pretty overwhelming invasion that basically thousands and thousands of soldiers marched into the Netherlands, and certainly the Dutch had no options but to basically surrender immediately. My dad was in the Dutch military at that particular time, and he said when they heard that the Germans had crossed into the Netherlands and were marching towards their little town in the province of Friesland, their commanding officer said, "Take your uniform jackets off and go home immediately. There's absolutely nothing we can do to stop the Germans." So that's what he did. This went on for a number of years, and I won't get into the war stories, but there were a lot of stories. My mother actually worked during the war. She delivered food stamps and food tickets to various people. That was the only way you could get food at the stores. Money was worthless. But anyways, by 1944, liberation began, and it began in Antwerp, Belgium. And the American and Canadian forces certainly started their process into Europe. It wasn't until February of 1945 when 200,000 Canadian soldiers began liberating towns and cities in the Netherlands. The Dutch have always viewed the Canadians as their liberators, because they're the ones that they saw, and those are the ones that marched into town. Those are the ones that dropped bread from airplanes and provided food. The winter of 1945 was a horrible winter in Europe, 1944, 1945. Traditionally, Europeans don't have extremely cold weather and snow, but this year they did. And it was an awful time because they had no heat either, no power, no electrical power. A lot of the stoves and utensils were removed by the Germans. They would come by. My mom said that one day they just came by and they opened up the doors, walked in, and they took all their pots and pans, they took their stove. Farmers lost a lot of their machinery, and this was all going for the German war effort to create steel. And so they were in pretty dire shape. They of course had no vehicles. A lot of the bicycles were even taken, and they had no money, and what money they had was deemed worthless at that particular time. 20 to 30,000 Dutch people died of starvation in the winter of 1945, and many, over 125,000, were diagnosed as having certainly severe starvation issues. The average weight loss for the Dutch over that winter was 30 pounds each. A lot of children were taken from the large cities like Amsterdam and moved to small communities, especially in Friesland, the northern province. And many people were boarding these young kids over that period of time. So there was a lot of begging going on as well. That's a great picture of a young boy with a spoon in his pocket waiting for something to eat. 120,000 Dutch Jews were sent to concentration camps during the war. Almost all of them died, 104,000. 23,000 Dutch died from air raids. Bert will talk a bit about more of that after. And 5,000 Dutch died in prisons. 2,800 Dutch were executed. I asked my father once, "Did you ever think about taking one of these guys out?" You know, and he says, "Oh no, you would never do that." Because if a German soldier didn't return and there was suspicions that he had been abducted or killed, they would just come into your village, pick out 10 men, line them up against the wall at the town hall, and execute them right there, and make sure everybody saw that. My dad was one of the 500,000 Dutch men that was taken to a German work camp. They would just pick you up, put you in a bus or a truck, and take you up to these camps. My dad was there for about 16 months. He said it wasn't that bad. They actually fed you, because if they didn't feed you, you couldn't work. And they actually even gave you some money, German marks, which of course were worthless at the end of the war.
Myno, I'd like to interject here. There's some fabulous movies made. Winter in Wartime is one of them,
Yeah.
and The Black Book. They're very realistic, so as well, you can get them from the library.
Yeah, they're great movies, and I've seen them both. So out of the 550,000 men that were taken to basically be laborers for the German soldiers, only 30,000 did not return. So that's actually not a bad statistic. And if you think the population of the Netherlands at that time was 8.8 million, about the same size as what we have in southern Ontario today. So the war was starting to end by the end of April 1945. The Germans did agree to a large food drop. 240 Lancaster bombers dropped 500 tons of rations from 400 feet, right up until May the 8th. 700 British and American planes dropped 1.6 million rations. So there was a lot of food, and the Dutch organized this distribution. There was no grab and run. It was done in a very typically Dutch organized fashion. They didn't have any vehicles to distribute, so they actually used Canadian trucks, and I'll show you some pictures here in a minute. So here's some of the food rations that were handed out to people that were essentially, many were starving by this time. They were eating tulip bulbs and whatever they could get their hands on. And there's some Canadian soldiers getting ready to distribute food. And they loaded these up into the military trucks and distributed them to the various communities. So my dad, as I said earlier, was in the Dutch Army, and there's a picture of him. He's the guy in the front. I don't know if you can zoom on that one, Bert. That's him right there. He's with the rifle. And as I said earlier, he never got to fight at all. He would have wanted to, he said, but there was no options at all at that particular time. This is his friend, Ari Boonstra, and my dad is the one on the right. And they're the ones that were out one day. They wanted to heat their house. It was in the winter of 44. And there was a dead tree in the back of their farm, and him and Ari went out to cut some limbs off and put it in their little fireplace. And while they were coming back, a German patrol came by and grabbed them. And the two of them ended up spending 16 months in a camp. I actually researched this guy's family after just to see, because I had this photograph, and it turned out that he had died just after the war of cancer, so I had no idea why. So there's a picture of the Canadians arriving, and you can see all the trucks along the canal there, and I'm sure that was a pleasant sight for a lot of the Dutch people that particular time. And it wasn't easy for the Germans either. They were in pretty dire straits by the end of the war. Just an example of, there's a German soldier there, and he looks pretty bedraggled right there. He's probably glad that it's all over. There's a nice picture of a Canadian soldier in the Netherlands. A few more shots. And you can just imagine the celebration. Once they realized that the war was over, people came out of their houses. They were throwing flowers and whatever they could at the soldiers who went by, jumping up on their tanks and their trucks. And it was just a huge celebration. There's some Canadian soldiers beside one of their tanks throwing their hats up in the air after they realized that the war was essentially over. And you can see here, there's a great picture of, I think this is in The Hague, and you can see how the soldiers were mobbed by the people who were so happy to have this war over with. There was also a Canadian side to the war. Queen Juliana, the Queen of the Netherlands at that time, and her children went to Ottawa. And they stayed there for 3 years. They lived in what is now Stornoway, the home of the opposition for the government of Canada. And Princess Margriet was born in Ottawa Hospital. And in order for her to be able to succeed as queen someday, she had to be born on Dutch soil. So what they did was the government of Canada officially made that room Dutch soil. And so she was officially born in the Netherlands, although she was born in Ottawa. And there's a picture of them there. And that was, Mackenzie King was the prime minister then, and he actually encouraged that. And there's a picture of Stornoway, where they lived. So by 1947, 1948, Mackenzie King opened Canada to immigrants. And certainly this was kind of a similar theme today to where we have a lot of offshore workers coming here to do agricultural work. And it was a vast shortage of agricultural workers here in Canada as well. So there was an agreement for 3 years to send over 15,000 farm workers. And my parents were, of course, one of them. And my dad had worked for his father on a farm there, and it was a real struggle after the war to try to make any money there, especially for two families, because they had no horse, they had no implements, and they had to basically start from scratch, and they had no money either. And the Dutch government encouraged people to leave, and certainly they paid for our fare to come here. Just a little note about the Tulips. 1945, after the war, the royal family sent 100,000 tulips to Ottawa as a thank you for them housing and keeping the Queen there and her family. And each spring to this day, they still send 10,000 tulips to Ottawa. So I'll just briefly run through my family, and then Bert can talk about his. This is our pre-immigration photograph before we left. In those days, my grandparents and our family in the Netherlands thought we'll never see them again. They're going to some foreign land over the ocean, and so a lot of photographs were taken. That's me between my parents there and my sister Tina. So we came on a ship called the Volendam, and it was first set out in 1922. So it was an older ship, and it was a cruise ship up until the war. And during 1940, it was used to transport children from England to New York City. And in 1940, it was torpedoed not far off the coast of Ireland and in the North Sea. And there were 1,150 on board, including 320 children. And a merchant marine ship came by, hooked onto it while it was slowly sinking, and managed to get it back into port. And the ship sank. Everybody got off, no one was injured. And when they brought the ship up, they found the torpedo still wedged in the front of the ship. It had not gone off. It just basically made a big hole, and that was it. So that was very fortunate. So it was the unexploded torpedo in the bow, and then it was refitted, and it became a ship to bring immigrants over to North America. So March 17th, our family left. Didn't cost us a penny for the cruise. The only thing my parents had to pay for what was called a kist, which is a wooden box, and it was about 300 guilders, which at that time was about $100. And that was it. Everything else was all looked after. Train fare, everything was looked after. And we arrived in Halifax at Pier 21 on March 27th, 1950.
And the kist contained all your parents' furniture, right?
Yeah, it came 3 weeks later. 3 to 4 weeks later, this kist came with us. So we had signed on with a farm family in Virgil, Ontario, which is quite close to Niagara-on-the-Lake. And this was the house that we lived in. It was an empty farmhouse. It's still there today. Last summer, my sister and I went there, and we visited the family, and the house looks essentially the same as it does today. The same family still lives there to this day. And so that's the house that we lived in. The Dutch were usually taken advantage of when they first came as far as vehicles were concerned. You had to have a car, especially if you lived in the country. And there were a lot of really questionable deals with vehicles. And this was one my dad bought, a 1946 Ford Standard. I think he paid $300, which is a lot of money when you're making like $70 a month, including your house. That's a pretty tough row to hoe to get a car like that. And anyway, it was just basically at the back of the lot, and it was a horrible car, but we had that for a few years. We lived on a hill, so in order to get up the hill, my dad had to put the car in reverse and back up the hill so that the gasoline would drain down into the carburetor.
Might interject here, Myno was a car buff. You show him a picture of an old car and he'll tell you what year it was. Okay, and Bert. Here we have our family. The home in the background here is kind of interesting. During that time, you weren't allowed to take your money out of Holland, only a certain amount. They wanted to have the people invest in Holland to get the infrastructure going. So this house my dad bought in Holland. It came in a large crate, and this is a place in Holland. My dad was a grocer. Well, my grandpa in the upper picture, he built a grocery business, and my dad took it over. But some interesting things. The Germans wanted to take this warehouse that my dad had stocked for groceries, and when they found out that I had tuberculosis, the Germans wanted nothing to do with it. So but later on they did take the house, and we were kicked out.
Was there an airport there or something?
Well, we were back onto an airport.
Yeah, Schiphol.
Yeah, my parents were expropriated because they had to enlarge the airport. Schiphol, or Amsterdam Airport, was one of the biggest airports in Europe. So I think it still is. And here's my dad. He failed to get into the military, in the Dutch military, because of his eyesight. He wanted to become a pilot. Was there a picture of him? No, the pilot. There he is. So that was his ambition, to become a pilot, but he became a grocer instead. Okay, Myno. What kind of a car is that, Myno?
It's a Morris Minor, yeah.
What year?
Oh, it's about a 52, 53.
So that's what my
50,
parents bought.
Somewhere on there. That was a fairly new car when you guys first moved here.
So there's the house, and this is interesting. The Toronto Star sent photographers over, and this is in one of the reprints. But the box that the house was in was so big and heavy, they couldn't offload it in the port in Quebec. So they dismantled it, and that's where you see 3,000 pieces on a flatbed arrived in Oshawa. It was a giant puzzle.
Yeah.
And what's kind of interesting, I came across a letter from a building inspector who said that this house would not be passed. The roof wouldn't be able to carry a snow load. My dad got taken in Holland. Myno mentioned there were shysters of all kinds, even among the Dutch. And the house was designed for Australia, which is, I mean, why my dad didn't know that. So anyways, the house is still standing. It's going to be demolished. It's close to Durham College, right more or less opposite. And anyways, that's the hardship.
There's a better picture of it.
So we lived there for a good number of years, and then I got married, and my dad moved on too. But this is an interesting point too. You weren't allowed to take excessive amounts of money. The Dutch government allowed you to take a certain amount of money out, but not all of it. So I was just telling my sister the other day that I saw my mother looking at the money in the end of her nylons in the suitcase. That's what she had stuffed in the surplus. And Myno had an interesting story this morning.
Yeah, a friend of mine, his dad drilled big holes into the legs of the tables. They were allowed to take furniture, and he rolled money up into the table legs. He was able to get that here and then go to the bank and transfer it over.
So there's a
At
bit
that
of
time, in 1951, a guilder was only worth about 30 cents. So it seemed like a lot of money in Holland, but when they got here, it wasn't.
I remember as a kid visiting in Holland to these different places where they display these model homes, just very similar to what they do here, a prefab. And anyways, you can see the $500 for that.
Yeah. That's a little bit more about the house.
It was an IKEA house. That was. It. As I mentioned, it was built opposite Durham College, and I remember my dad buying the lot for about $500, which was quite a bit of money in those days. But anyways, he found work right away at GM, because GM was just starting to really boom.
Yeah, and that's why one of the reasons why they needed farmers, because a lot of these young farm men were working in the factories in the Oshawa area, and because they were hiring like crazy after the war. So the salaries, of course, were much better at General Motors than they were on a farm. So this is May 4th, 2020. That's this year. Again, it was every year there's a celebration in Ottawa about the liberation of the Netherlands. And this particular year, it was a very quiet event. Just basically the Consul General and the Deputy Consul General from the Netherlands were at Ottawa, and they presented a wreath, and that was essentially it. But usually it's quite a celebration every year on May the 4th, and certainly in the Netherlands. And one of the things that happens every year is that Canadian soldiers that fought in World War II would go there, especially the ones that fought in the Netherlands. They would go there and, of course, welcomed with open arms. They've had parades for them. They'd have old Jeeps set up for them to ride in from World War II. And they would, of course, the Dutch would congregate wearing their traditional orange, and they would hand them flowers and roses. And this has gone on ever since the war. But, of course, now, if you think about it, how old are these people? And there were well over 1 million soldiers that went to fight in World War II. And the last statistic I saw was from fall of 2019. There were only 33,000 left. And if you think about it, most of these guys were 20, 21, 22 years old when they went to fight for our country. And so that means in 1939, that would put them almost at 100 years of age today.
But I noticed that even the younger generation of Dutch are eternally grateful. They may not have experienced war like the old timers, but boy, they bend over backwards to help a Canadian. They even pay their fare over there for the celebration.
Yeah, it was all looked after. Plus, they look after the students in the Netherlands are assigned to look after the gravestones of soldiers that we've lost. So more than 45,000 gave their lives, and another 55,000 were wounded. And so you can see more than 1 million Canadians went there, and of that, something like 3% are left. So on behalf of my family, Bert can thank too, we thank Canada for giving us this opportunity to be here and have a great life. And our parents decided to send us here, to come here, because for the children, that's what they said.
Yeah, that was
emotional now.
that was mentioned in our family too, that they saw opportunities in Canada where after the war, they didn't see opportunities in Holland. And, you know, the gratitude. Now, it was, mind you, there may be a lot of gratitude for coming to a good country like Canada, but it was it was tough to separate families. And, my mother had a hard time.
Yeah, but they did it, and we appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching this